through, and for a time it was a Norman city. Now it is a pasture for sheep. Latest as yet is Salisbury, English, real English. It may last a few centuries still. It is little more than 700 years old, but when I think of those great hangars back there by Stonehenge, I feel that the next phase is already beginning, of a world one will fly to the ends of in a week or so. Our world still. Our people, your people and mine who are going to take wing so soon now, were made in all these places. We are visiting the old homes. I am glad I came back to it just when you were doing the same thing. I'm lucky to have found a sympathetic fellow traveller, she said, with a car. You're the first American I've ever met whose interest in history didn't seem... He sought for an inoffensive word. Silly? Oh, I admit it. It's true of a lot of us, most of us. We come over to Europe as if it hadn't anything to do with us except to supply us with old pictures and curiosity. Generally, we come sightseeing, it's romantic, it's picturesque. We stare at the natives like visitors at a zoo. We don't realize that we belong. I know our style, but we aren't all like that. Some of us are learning a bit better than that. We have one or two teachers over there to lighten our darkness. There's Professor Breasted, for instance. He comes sometimes to my father's house. And there's James Harvey Robinson and Professor Hutton Webster. They've been trying to restore our memory. I've never heard of any of them, said Sir Richmond. You hear so little of America over here. It's quite a large country and all sorts of interesting things happen there nowadays. And we are waking up to history quite fast. We shan't always be the most ignorant people in the world. We are beginning to realize that quite a lot of things happened between Adam and the Mayflower that we ought to be told about. I allow it's a recent revival. The United States has been like one of those men you read about in the papers who go away from home and turn up in some distant place with their memories gone. They've forgotten what their names were, or where they lived, or what they did for a living. They've forgotten everything that matters. Often they have to begin again and settle down for a long time before their memories come back. That's how it has been with us. Our memories just coming back to us. And what do you find you are? Europeans, who came away from kings and churches and Corinthian capitals. You feel all this country belongs to you? As much as it does to you. Sir Richmond smiled radiantly at her. But if I say that America belongs to me as much as it does to you... We are one people, she said. We? Europe. These parts of Europe anyhow. And ourselves. You are the most civilized person I have met for weeks and weeks. Well, you are the first civilized person I've met in Europe for a long time, if I understand you. There are multitudes of reasonable, civilized people in Europe. I've heard or seen very little of them. They're scattered, I admit, and hard to find. So ours is a lucky meeting. I've wanted a serious talk to an American for some time. I want to know very badly what you think you are up to with the world, our world. I'm equally anxious to know what England thinks she is doing. Her ways recently have been a little difficult to understand. On any hypothesis, that is honourable to her. Said Sir Richmond. I assure you we don't like it. This Irish business, we feel a sort of ownership in England. It's like finding your dearest aunt torturing the cat. We must talk of that, said Sir Richmond. I wish you would. It's a cat and a dog, and they have been very naughty animals, and poor Aunt Britannia almost deliberately lost her temper, but I admit she hits about in a very nasty fashion, and favours the dog. She does. I want to know all you admit. You shall. And incidentally, my friend and I may have the pleasure of showing you Salisbury and Avebury, if you are free. We're travelling together, just we two. We are wandering about the south of England on our way to Falmouth, where I join a father in a few days' time, and I go with him to Paris. And if you and your friend are coming to the Old George... We are, said Sir Richmond. I see no great scandal in talking right on to bedtime and seeing Avebury tomorrow. Why not? Perhaps if we did as the Germans do and gave our names now, it might mitigate something of the extreme informality of our behaviour. My name is Hardy. I've been a munition manufacturer. I was slightly wounded by a stray shell near Arras while I was inspecting some plant I had set up, and also I was hit by a stray knighthood. So my name is now Sir Richmond Hardy. My friend is a very distinguished Harley Street physician, chiefly nervous and mental cases. His name is Dr. Martineau. He is quite as civilized as I am. He is also a philosophical writer. He is really a very wise and learned man indeed. He is full of ideas. He stimulated me tremendously. You must talk to him. Sir Richmond glanced over his shoulder at the subject of these commendations. Through the oval window glared an expression of malignity that made no impression whatever on his preoccupied mind. My name, said the young lady, is Grammont. The war whirled me over to Europe on Red Cross work, and since the peace I've been settling up things and travelling about Europe. My father is rather a big businessman in New York. The Earl Grammont? He is rather deep in oil, I believe. He is coming over to Europe because he does not like the way your people are behaving in Mesopotamia. He is on his way to Paris now. Paris, it seems, is where everything is to be settled against you. Belinda is the sort of companion I have acquired for the purposes of independent travel. She was Red Cross too. I must have somebody, and I cannot bear a maid. Her name is Belinda Seifert. From Philadelphia originally. You have that, Seifert. Grammont? And Hardy? Sir Richmond and Dr. Martineau. And that great green bank there, just coming into sight, must be old Sarum, the little ancient city that faded away when Salisbury lifted its spire into the world. We will stop here for a little while. Then it was that Dr. Martineau was grim about the sketching of his legs. Section 4. The sudden prospect which now opened out before Sir Richmond of talking about history and such like topics with a charming companion for perhaps 2 whole days, instead of going on with this tiresome, shamefaced, egotistical business of self-examination, was so attractive to him that it took immediate possession of his mind, to the entire exclusion and disregard of Dr. Martineau's possible objections to any such modification of their original programme. When they arrived in Salisbury, the doctor did make some slight effort to suggest a different hotel from that in which the 2 ladies had engaged their rooms. But on the spur of the moment, and in their presence, he could produce no sufficient reason for refusing the accommodation the old George had ready for him. He was reduced to a vague, "We don't want to inflict ourselves." He could not get Sir Richmond aside for any adequate expression of his feelings about Miss Seifert, before the 4 of them were seated together at tea amidst the medieval modernity of the old George smoking room. And only then did he begin to realize the depth and the extent of the engagements to which Sir Richmond had committed himself. "I was suggesting that we run back to Avebury tomorrow," said Sir Richmond. These ladies were nearly missing it. The thing took the doctor's breath away. For the moment he could say nothing. He stared over his teacup, dour-faced. An objection formulated itself very slowly. "But that Dicky," he whispered. His whisper went unnoted. Sir Richmond was talking of the completeness of Salisbury. From the very beginning it had been a cathedral city. It was essentially and purely that. The church, at its best, in the full tide of its medieval ascendancy, had called it into being. He was making some extremely loose and inaccurate generalizations about the buildings and ruins each age had left of posterity. And Miss Grammont was countering with equally unsatisfactory qualifications. "Our age will leave the ruins of hotels," said Sir Richmond. "Railway arches and hotels, baths and aqueducts," Miss Grammont compared. "Rome of the Empire comes nearest to it." As soon as tea was over, Dr. Martineau realized they meant to walk round and about Salisbury. He foresaw that walk with the utmost clearness. In front, and keeping just a little beyond the range of his intervention, Sir Richmond would go with Miss Grammont. He himself and Miss Seyffert would bring up the rear. If I do, he muttered, I'll be damned. An unusually strong expression for him. You said, asked Miss Seyffert, that I have some writing to do before the post goes, said the doctor, brightly. Oh, come and see the cathedral, cried Sir Richmond with ill-concealed dismay. He was, if one may put it in such a fashion, not looking at Miss Seyffert in the director's fashion when he said this. I'm afraid, said the doctor mullishly, impossible, with the unspoken addition of, you try her for a bit. Miss Grammont stood up. Everybody stood up. We can go first to look for shops, she said. There's those things you want to buy, Belinda, a fountain pen and the little books. We can all go together as far as that. And while you're shopping, if you wouldn't mind getting one or two things for me. It became clear to Dr. Martineau that Sir Richmond was to be let off Belinda. It seemed abominably unjust, and it was also clear to him that he must keep closely to his own room, or he might find Miss Seyffert drifting back alone to the hotel and eager to resume with him. Well, a quiet time in his room would not be disagreeable. He could think over his notes, but in reality he thought over nothing but the little speeches he would presently make to Sir Richmond about the unwarrantable, the absolutely unwarrantable alterations that were being made without his consent in their common programme. For a long time, Sir Richmond had met no one so interesting and amusing as this frank-minded young woman from America. Young woman was how he thought of her. She didn't correspond to anything so prim and restrained and extensively reserved and withheld as a young lady. And though he judged her no older than 25, the word girl, with its associations of virginal ignorances, invisible purdah, and trite ideas newly discovered, seemed even less appropriate for her than the word boy. She had an air of having in some obscure way graduated in life, as if so far she had lived each several year of her existence in a distinctive and conclusive manner, with the utmost of mental profit and no particular tarnish or injury. He could talk with her as if he talked with a man like himself, but with a zest no man could give him. It was evident that the good things she had said at first came as the natural expression of a broad stream of alert thought. They were no mere display specimens from one of those jackdaw collections of bright things so many clever women waste their wits in accumulating. She was not talking for effect at all. She was talking because she was tremendously interested in her discovery of the spectacle of history and delighted to find another person as possessed as she was. Belinda having been conducted to her shops, the two made their way through the bright evening sunlight to the compact gracefulness of the cathedral. A glimpse through a wrought iron gate of a delightful garden of spring flowers, alyssum, aubrietia, snow upon the mountains, daffodils, narcissus, and the like, held them for a time, and then they came out upon the level, grassy space, surrounded by little ripe old houses on which the cathedral stand. They stood for some moments surveying it. It's a perfect little lady of a cathedral, said Sir Richmond. But why, I wonder, did we build it? Your memory ought to be better than mine, she said, with her half-closed eyes blinking up at the sunlit spire sharp against the blue. I've been away for so long over there that I forget altogether. Why did we build it? She had fallen in quite early with this freak of speaking and thinking as if he and she were all mankind. It was as if her mind had been prepared for it by her own eager exploration of Europe. My friend, the philosopher, he had said, will not have it that we are really the individuals we think we are. You must talk to him. He is a very curious and subtle thinker. We are just thoughts in the mind of the race, he says, passing thoughts. We are, what does he call it? Man on his planet taking control of life. Man and woman, she had amended. But just as a man on his planet taking control of life had failed altogether to remember why the ditch at Avebury was on the inside instead of the outside of the vallum. So now Miss Grammont and Sir Richmond found very great difficulty in recalling why they had built Salisbury Cathedral. We built temples by habit and tradition, said Sir Richmond, but the impulse was losing its force. She looked up at the spire and then at him with a faintly quizzical expression, but he had his reply ready. We were beginning to feel our power over matter. We were already very clever engineers. What interested us here wasn't the old religion anymore. We wanted to exercise the display of our power over stone. We made it into reeds and branches. We squirted it up in all these spires and pinnacles. The priest and his altar were just an excuse. Do you think people have ever feared and worshipped in this artist's lark as they did in Stonehenge? I certainly do not remember that I ever worshipped there, she said. Sir Richmond was in love with this idea. The spirit of the Gothic cathedrals, he said, is the spirit of the skyscrapers. It is architecture in a mood of flaming ambition. The Freemasons on the building could hardly refrain from jeering at the little priests they had left down there, below there, performing antiquated puerile mysteries at his altar. He was just their excuse for doing it all. Skyscrapers, she conceded. An early part of the skyscraper spirit. You are doing your best to make me feel thoroughly at home. You are more at home here still than in that country of yours over the Atlantic. But it seems to me now that I do begin to remember building this cathedral and all the other cathedrals we built in Europe. It was the fun of building that made us do it. She said, and my skyscrapers? Still the fun of building. That is the thing I envy most about America. It's still large enough, mentally and materially, to build all sorts of things. Over here, the sites are frightfully crowded. And what do you think we are building now? And what do you think you are building over here? What are we building now? I believe we have almost grown up. I believe it is time we begin to build in earnest, for good. But are we building anything at all? A new world. Show it to me, she said. We're still only at the foundations, said Sir Richmond. Nothing shows as yet. I wish I could believe they were foundations, but you can doubt. We are scraping the old. It was too late in the afternoon to go into the cathedral, so they strolled to and fro, round and about the west end and along the path under the trees towards the river, exchanging their ideas very frankly and freely about the things that had recently happened to the world and what they thought they ought to be doing in it. Section 5. After dinner, our 4 tourists sat late and talked in a corner of the smoking room. The 2 ladies had vanished hastily at the first dinner gong and reappeared at the second, mysteriously and pleasantly changed from tweedy pedestrians to indoor company. They were quietly but definitely dressed. Pretty alterations had happened to their coiffure. A silver band and deep red stones lit the dusk of Miss Grammont's hair, and a necklace of the same colourings kept the peace between her jolly sunburnt cheek and her soft, untanned neck. It was evident her recent uniform had included a collar of great severity. Miss Seyffert had revealed a plump forearm and proclaimed it with a clash of bangles. Dr. Martineau thought her evening throat too much confidential. The conversation drifted from topic to topic. It had none of the steady continuity of Sir Richmond's dialogue with Miss Grammont. Miss Seyffert's methods were too discursive and exclamatory. She broke every thread that appeared. The old George at Salisbury is really old. It shows it, and Miss Seyffert laced the entire evening with her recognition of the fact. Just look at that old beam, she would cry suddenly, to think it was exactly where it is, before there was a Cabot in America. Miss Grammont let her companion pull the talk about as she chose. After the animation of the afternoon, a sort of lazy contentment had taken possession of the younger lady. She sat deep in a basket chair and spoke now and then. Miss Seyffert gave her impressions of France and Italy. She talked of the cabmen of Naples and the beggars of Amalfi. Apropos of beggars, Miss Grammont, from the depths of her chair, threw out the statement that Italy was frightfully overpopulated. In some parts of Italy, it is like mites on a cheese. Nobody seems to be living. Everybody is too busy keeping alive. Poor old women carrying loads big enough for mules, said Miss Seyffert. Little children working like slaves, said Miss Grammont, and everybody begging, even the people at work by the roadside who ought to be getting wages sufficient. Begging from foreigners is just a sport in Italy, said Sir Richmond. It doesn't imply want, but I agree that a large part of Italy is frightfully overpopulated. The whole world is. Don't you think so, Martineau? Well, yes, for its present social organization. For any social organization, said Sir Richmond. I've no doubt of it, said Miss Seyffert, and added amazingly, I'm out of birth control all the time. A brief but active pause ensued. Dr. Martineau, in a state of sudden distress, attempted to drink out of a cold and empty coffee cup. The world swarms with cramped and undeveloped lives, said Sir Richmond, which amount to nothing, which do not even represent happiness, and which help to use up the resources, the fuel and surplus energy of the world. I suppose they have a sort of liking for their lives, Miss Grammont reflected. Does that matter? They do nothing to carry on life. They are just vain repetitions, imperfect, dreary, blurred repetitions of one common life. All that they feel has been felt. All that they do has been done better before, because they are crowded and hurried and underfed and undereducated. And as for liking their lives, they need never have had the chance. How many people are there in the world? She asked abruptly. I don't know, 1,200, 1,500 million perhaps? And in your world? I'd have 250 million, let us say. At most, it would be quite enough for this little planet. For a time, at any rate. Don't you think so, Doctor? I don't know, said Dr. Martineau. Oddly enough, I have never thought about that question before, at least not from this angle. But could you pick out 250 million aristocrats? Began Miss Grammont. My native instinctive democracy. Need not be outraged, said Sir Richmond. Any 250 million would do. They'd be able to develop fully, all of them. As things are, only a minority can do that. The rest never get a chance. That's what I always say, said Miss Seyffert. A new age, said Dr. Martineau, a new world. We may be coming to such a stage when population, as much as fuel, will be under a world control. If one thing, why not the other? I admit that the movement of thought is away from haphazard towards control. I'm for control all the time, Miss Seyffert injected, following up her previous success. I admit, the doctor began his broken sentence again with marked patience, that the movement of thought is away from haphazard towards control, in things generally, but is the movement of events? The eternal problem of man, said Sir Richmond. Can our wills prevail? There came a little pause. Miss Grammont smiled at inquiry at Miss Seyffert. If you are, said Belinda. I wish I could imagine your world, said Miss Grammont, rising, of 250 million of fully developed human beings with room to live and breathe in, and no need for wars. Will they live in palaces? Will they all be healthy? Machines will wait on them. No, I can't imagine it. Perhaps I shall dream of it. My dreaming self may be cleverer. She held out her hand to Sir Richmond. Just for a moment they stood hand in hand, appreciatively. Well, said Dr. Martineau, as the door closed behind the two Americans, this is a curious encounter. That young woman has brains, said Sir Richmond, standing before the fireplace. There was no doubt whatever which young woman he meant. But Dr. Martineau grunted. I don't like the American type, the doctor pronounced judicially. I do, Sir Richmond countered. The doctor thought for a moment or so. You are committed to the project of visiting Avebury, he said. They ought to see Avebury, said Sir Richmond. Said the doctor, ostentatiously amused by his thoughts and staring at the fire. Birth control. I never did. Sir Richmond smiled down on the top of the doctor's head and said nothing. I think, said the doctor, and paused, I shall leave this Avebury expedition to you. We can be back in the early afternoon, said Sir Richmond, to give them a chance of seeing the cathedral. The chapter house here is not one to miss. And then I suppose we shall go on, as you please, said Sir Richmond insincerely. I must confess that 4 people make the car at any rate seem tremendously overpopulated, and to tell the truth, I do not find this encounter so amusing as you seem to do. I shall not be sorry when we have waved goodbye to those young ladies and resume our interrupted conversation. Sir Richmond considered something mullish in the doctor's averted face. I find Miss Grammont an extremely interesting and stimulating human being. Evidently, the doctor sighed, stood up, and found himself delivering one of the sentences he had engendered during his solitary meditations in his room before dinner. He surprised himself by the plainness of his speech. Let me be frank, he said, regarding Sir Richmond squarely. Considering the general situation of things and your position, I do not care very greatly for the part of an accessory to what may easily develop, as you know very well, into a very serious flirtation. An absurd, mischievous, irrelevant flirtation. You may not like the word, you may pretend it is a conversation, an ordinary intellectual conversation. That is not the word. Simply that is not the word. You people eye one another. Flirtation. I give the affair its proper name. That's all. Merely that, when I think, but we will not discuss it now. Good night. Forgive me if I put before you, rather bluntly, my particular point of view. Sir Richmond found himself alone with his eyebrows raised. Section 6. After 24 eventful hours, our 2 students of human motives found themselves together again by the fireplace in the old George smoking room. They had resumed their overnight conversation in a state of considerable tension. If you find the accommodation of the car insufficient, said Sir Richmond in a tone of extreme reasonableness, and I admit it is, we can easily hire a larger car in a place like this. I would not care if you hired an omnibus, said Dr. Martineau. I am not coming on if these young women are. But if you consider it scandalous, and really, Martineau, really, as one man to another, it does seem to me to be a bit pernickety of you, a broad and original thinker as you are. Thought is one matter, rash, inconsiderate action quite another. And above all, if I spend another day in or near the company of Miss Belinda Seyffert, I shall be extremely rude to her. But, said Richmond, and bit his lower lip and considered. We might drop Belinda, he suggested, turning to his friend and speaking in a low, confidential tone. She is quite a manageable person, quite. She could, for example, be left behind with the luggage and sent on by train. I don't know if you realize how the land lies in that quarter. It needs only a word to Miss Grammont. There was no immediate reply. For a moment he had a wild hope that his companion would agree, and then he perceived that the doctor's silence meant only the preparation of an ultimatum. I object to Miss Grammont and that side of the thing, for more I do to Miss Seyffert. Sir Richmond said nothing. It may help you to see this affair from a slightly different angle if I tell you that twice today Miss Seyffert has asked me if you were a married man, and of course you told her I was. On the second occasion. Sir Richmond smiled again. Frankly, said the doctor, this adventure is altogether uncongenial to me. It is the sort of thing that has never happened in my life, this highway coupling. Don't you think, said Sir Richmond, that you are attaching rather too much, what shall I say, romantic, flirtatious meaning to this affair? I don't mind that after my rather lavish confessions, you should consider me a rather oversexed person, but isn't your attitude rather unfair, unjust indeed, and almost insulting to this Miss Grammont? After all, she's a young lady of very good social position indeed. She doesn't strike you, does she, as an undignified or helpless human being? Her manners suggest a person of considerable self-control, and knowing less of me than you do, she probably regards me as almost as safe as a maiden aunt say. I'm twice her age. We are a party of four. There are conventions. There are considerations. Aren't you really, my dear Martineau, overdoing all this side of this very pleasant little enlargement of our interests? Am I? Said Dr. Martineau, and brought a scrutinizing eye to bear on Sir Richmond's face. I want to go on talking to Miss Grammont for a day or so, Sir Richmond admitted. Then I shall prefer to leave your party. There were some moments of silence. I am really very sorry to find myself in this dilemma, said Sir Richmond with a note of genuine regret in his voice. It is not a dilemma, said Dr. Martineau with a corresponding loss of asperity. I grant you we discover we differ upon a question of taste and convenience. But before I suggested this trip, I had intended to spend a little time with my old friend, Sir Kenelm Latter, at Bournemouth. Nothing simpler than to go to him now. I shall be sorry all the same. I could have wished, said the doctor, that these ladies had happened a little later. The matter was settled. Nothing more of a practical nature remained to be said, but neither gentleman wished to break off with a harsh and bare decision. When the new age is here, said Sir Richmond, then surely a friendship between a man and a woman will not be subjected to the inconveniences your present code would set about it. They would travel about together as they choose. So long as other lives are not affected, in matters of personal behavior, the world will probably be much more free and individuals much more open in their conscience and honor than they have ever been before. In matters of property, economics, and public conduct, it will probably be just the reverse. Then there will be much more collective control and much more insistence, legal insistence, upon individual responsibility. But we are not living in the new age yet. We are living in the patched up ruins of a very old one. And you, if you will forgive me, are living in the patched up remains of a life that had already had its complications. This young lady, whose charm and cleverness, I admit, behaves as if the new age were already here, well, that may be a very dangerous mistake both for her and for you. This affair, if it goes on for a few days more, may involve very serious consequences indeed, with which I, for one, do not wish to be involved. Sir Richmond, upon the hearthrug, had a curious feeling that he was back in the headmaster's study at Caxton. Dr. Martineau went on with his lucidity that Sir Richmond found rather trying to give his impression of Miss Grammont and her position in life. She is, he said, manifestly a very expensively educated girl, and in many ways interesting. I have been watching her. I have not been favoured with very much of her attention, but that fact has enabled me to see her profile. Miss Seyffert is a fairly crude mixture of frankness, insincerity, and self-explanatory egotism, and I have been able to disregard a considerable amount of the conversation she has addressed to me. Now, I guess this Miss Grammont has had no mother since she was quite little. Your guesses, Doctor, are apt to be pretty good, said Sir Richmond. You know that? She has told me as much. Well, she impressed me as having the air of a girl who has had to solve many problems for which the normal mother provides ready solutions. That is how I inferred that there was no mother. I don't think there has been any stepmother, either friendly or hostile. There hasn't been, I thought not. She has had various governesses and companions, ladies of birth and education, engaged to look after her as she has done exactly what she liked with them. Her manner with Miss Seyffert, an excellent manner for Miss Seyffert, by the by, isn't the sort of manner anyone acquires in a day, or for one person only. She is a very sure and commanding young woman. Sir Richmond nodded. I suppose her father adores and neglects her, and whenever she has wanted a companion or governess butchered, the thing has been done. These business Americans, I'm told, neglect their womenkind, give them money and power, let them loose on the world. It's a sort of moral laziness, masquerading as affection. Still, I suppose custom and tradition keep this girl in her place, and she was petted, honoured, amused, talked about, but not in a harmful way, and rather bored right up to the time when America came into the war. Theoretically, she had a tremendously good time. I think this must be near the truth of her biography, said Sir Richmond. I suppose she has lovers. You don't mean? No, I don't. Though that is a matter that ought to have no special interest for you. I mean that she was surrounded by a retinue of men who wanted to marry her or who behaved as though they wanted to marry her or who made her happiness and her gratifications and her condescensions seem a matter of very great importance to them. She had the flattery of an extremely uncritical and unexacting admiration. That is the sort of thing that gratifies a silly woman extremely. Miss Grammont is not silly, and all his homage and facile approval probably bored her more than she realized. To anyone too intelligent to be steadily excited by buying things and wearing things and dancing and playing games and going to places of entertainment and being given flowers, sweets, jewellery, pet animals and books bound in special sort of leather, the prospect of being a rich man's only daughter until such time as it becomes advisable to change into a rich man's wealthy wife is probably not nearly so amusing as envious people might suppose. I take it Miss Grammont had got all she could out of that sort of thing some time before the war, and that she had already read and thought rather more than most young women in her position. Before she was 20, I guess she was already looking for something more interesting in the way of men than a richer admirer with an automobile full of presents. Those who seek find. What do you think she found? What would a rich girl find out there in America? I don't know. I haven't the material to guess with. In London, a girl might find a considerable variety of active, interesting men, rising politicians, university men of distinction, artists and writers even, men of science, men, there are still such men, active in the creative work of the empire. In America, I suppose, there is at least an equal variety made up of rather different types. She would find that life was worthwhile to such people in a way that made the ordinary entertainment and amusements of her life a monstrous, silly waste of time. With the facility of her sex, she would pick up from one of them the idea that made life worthwhile for him. I am inclined to think there was someone in her case who did seem to promise a sort of life that was worthwhile, and that somehow the war came to alter the look of that promise. How? I don't know. Perhaps I am only romancing, but for this young woman, I am convinced this expedition to Europe has meant experience, harsh educational experience, and very profound mental disturbance. There have been love experiences, experiences that were something more than treats and attentions and proposals that made up her life when she was sheltered over there, and something more than that. What it is, I don't know. The war has turned an ugly face to her. She has seen death and suffering and ruin. Perhaps she has seen people she knew killed. Perhaps the man has been killed. Or she has met with cowardice or cruelty or treachery where she didn't expect it. She has been shocked out of the first confidence of youth. She has ceased to take the world for granted. It hasn't broken her, but has matured her. That, I think, is why history has become real to her, which so attracts you in her. History for her has ceased to be a fabric of picturesque incidents. It is the study of a tragic struggle that still goes on. She sees history as you see it, and I see it. She is a very grown-up young woman. It's just that, said Sir Richmond. It's just that. If you see as much in Miss Grammont as all that, why don't you want to come on with us? You see the interest of her. I see a lot more than that. You don't know what an advantage it is to be as I am, rather cold and unresponsive to women and unattractive and negligible. Negligible. That is the exact word to them. You can't look at a woman for 5 minutes without losing sight of her in the midst of imaginative excitement, because she looks back at you. I have the privilege of the negligible, which is a cool head. Miss Grammont has a startled and matured mind, an original mind. Yes, there is something more to be said. Her intelligence is better than her character. I don't quite see what you are driving at. The intelligence of all intelligent women is better than their characters. Goodness in a woman, as we understand it, seems to imply necessarily a certain imaginative fixity. Miss Grammont has an impulsive and adventurous character, and as I have been saying, she was a spoilt child with no discipline. You also are a person of high intelligence and defective controls. She is very much at loose ends. You, on account of the illness of a rather forgotten lady, Miss Martin Leeds, aren't you rather abusing the secrets of the confessional? This is the confessional. It closes tomorrow morning, but it is the confessional still. Look at the thing frankly. You, I say, are also at loose ends. Can you deny it, my dear sir? Don't we both know that ever since we left London, you have been ready to fall in love with any pretty thing in petticoats that seemed to promise you 3 halfpenny worth of kindness? A lost dog looking for a master. You're a stray man looking for a mistress. Miss Grammont, being a woman, is a little more selective than that. But if she's at a loose end, as I suppose, she isn't protected by the sense of having made her selection, and she has no preconceptions of what she wants. You are a very interesting man in many ways. You carry marriage and entanglements lightly, with an air of being neither married nor entangled. She is quite prepared to fall in love with you. But you don't really think that, said Sir Richmond, with an ill-concealed eagerness. Dr. Martineau rolled his face towards Sir Richmond. These miracles grotesquely happen, he said. She knows nothing of Martin Leeds. You must remember that. And then, he added, if she and you fall in love, as the phrase goes, what is to follow? There was a pause. Sir Richmond looked at his toes for a moment or so, as if he took counsel with them, and then decided to take offence. Really, he said, this is preposterous. You talk of falling in love as though it was impossible for a man and woman to be deeply interested in each other without that. And the gulf in our ages, in our quality. From the psychologist of a new age, I find this amazing. Are men and women to go on forever, separated by this possibility into 2 hardly communicating and yet interpenetrating worlds? Is there never to be friendship and companionship between men and women without passion? You ought to know even better than I do that there is not, for such people as you two anyhow. And at present, the world is not prepared to tolerate friendship and companionship with that accompaniment. That is the core of this situation. A pause fell between the 2 gentlemen. They had smoothed over the extreme harshness of their separation, and there was very little more to be said. Well, said Sir Richmond, in conclusion, I am very sorry indeed, Martineau, that we have to part like this. Chapter 7. Companionship. Section 1. Well, said Dr. Martineau, extending his hand to Sir Richmond on the Salisbury station platform, I leave you to it. His round face betrayed little or no vestiges of his overnight irritation. Ought you to leave me to it? Smiled Sir Richmond. I shall be interested to learn what happens, but if you won't stay to see. Now, sir, please, said the guard respectfully but firmly, and Dr. Martineau got in. Sir Richmond walked thoughtfully down the platform towards the exit. What else could I do? He asked aloud to nobody in particular. For a little while he thought confusedly of the collapse of his expedition into the secret places of his own heart with Dr. Martineau, and then his preposition with Miss Grammont resumed possession of his mind. Dr. Martineau was forgotten. Section 2. For the better part of 40 hours, Sir Richmond had either been talking to Miss Grammont or carrying on imaginary conversations with her in her absence, or sleeping and dreaming dreams in which she never failed to play a part, even if at times it was an altogether amazing and incongruous part. And as they were both very frank and expressive people, they already knew a very great deal about each other. For an American, Miss Grammont was by no means autobiographical. She gave no sketches of her idiosyncrasies, and she repeated no remembered comments and profits of her contemporaries about herself. She either concealed or she had lost any great interest in her own personality, but she was interested in and curious about the people she had met in life, and her talk of them reflected a considerable amount of light upon her own upbringing and experiences. And her liking for Sir Richmond was pleasingly manifest. She liked his turn of thought. She watched him with a faint smile on her lips as he spoke, and she spread her opinions before him carefully in that soft voice of hers, like a shy child showing its treasures to some suddenly trusted and favoured visitor. Their ways of thought harmonized. They talked at first chiefly about history of the world and the extraordinary situation of aimlessness in the phase of ruin to which the Great War had brought all Europe, if not all mankind. The world excited them both in the same way, as a crisis in which they were called upon to do something. They did not yet clearly know that. Into this topic they peered as into some deep pool, side by side, and in it they saw each other reflected. The visit to Avebury had been a great success. It had been a perfect springtime day, and the little inn had been delighted at the reappearance of Sir Richmond's car so soon after its departure. Its delight was particularly manifest in the cream and salad it produced for lunch. Both Miss Grammont and Miss Seyffert displayed an intelligent interest in their food. After lunch, they had all gone out to the stones and the wall. Half a dozen sunburnt children were putting one of the partially overturned megaliths to a happy use by clambering to the top of it and sliding on their little behinds down its smooth and sloping side amidst much mirthful squealing. Sir Richmond and Miss Grammont had walked round the old circumvallation together, but Belinda Seyffert had strayed away from them, professing an interest in flowers. It was not so much that she felt that they had to be left together that made her do this, as her own consciousness of being possessed by a devil who interrupted conversations. When Miss Grammont was keenly interested in the conversation, then Belinda had learnt from experience that it was wiser to go off with her devil out of the range of any temptation to interrupt. "You really think," said Miss Grammont, "that it would be possible to take this confused old world and reshape it, set it marching towards that new world of yours of 250 million fully developed, beautiful, and happy people? Why not? Nobody is doing anything with the world except muddle about. Why not give it a direction? You take it in your hands like clay, obdurate clay with a sort of recalcitrant, unintelligent life of its own." Her imagination glowed in her eyes and warmed her voice. "I believe what you say is possible if people dare. I am tired of following little motives that are like flames that go out when you get to them. I am tired of seeing all the world doing the same. I am tired of a world in which there is nothing great but great disasters. Here is something mankind can attempt, that we can attempt, and will. I believe that as man grows up, this is the business man has to settle down to, and will settle down to." She considered that. "I've been getting to believe something like this, but it frightens me. I suppose most of us have this sort of dread of taking too much upon ourselves. So we just live like pigs. Sensible little piggy-wiggies. I've got a committee full of that sort of thing. We live like little modest pigs and let the world go hang, and pride ourselves upon our freedom from the sin of presumption. Not quite that. Well, how do you put it?" "We are afraid," she said. "It's too vast. We want bright little lives of our own." "Exactly. Sensible little piggy-wiggies. We have a right to life and happiness." "First," said Sir Richmond, "as much right as a pig has to food. But whether we get life and happiness or fail to get them, we human beings who have imaginations and something more nowadays, of course, we want bright lives. Of course, we want happiness. Just as we want food, just as we want sleep. But when we have eaten, when we have slept, when we have jolly things about us, it is nothing. We have been made an exception of and got our rations. The big thing confronts us still. It is vast, I agree, but vast as it is the thing we have to think about. I don't know why it should be so, but I am compelled by something in my nature to want to serve this idea of a new age for mankind. I want it as my culminating want. I want a world in order, a disciplined mankind going on to greater things. Don't you? Now you tell me of it, she said with a smile. I do. But before, no, you've made it clear. It wasn't clear before. I've been talking this sort of thing with my friend Dr. Martineau, and I've been thinking as well as talking. That perhaps is why I'm so clear and positive. I don't complain that you are clear and positive. I've been coming along the same way. It's refreshing to meet you. I found it refreshing to meet Martineau. A twinge of conscience about Dr. Martineau turned Sir Richmond into a new channel. He's a most interesting man, he said, rather shy in some respects, devoted to his work, and he's writing a book which has saturated him in these ideas. Only 2 nights ago, we stood here and talked about it. The psychology of a new age, the world, he believes, is entering upon a new phase of its history, the adolescence, so to speak, of mankind. It is an idea that seizes the imagination. There is a flow of new ideas abroad, he thinks, widening realizations, unprecedented hopes and fears. There is a consciousness of new powers and new responsibilities. We are sharing the adolescence of our race. It is giving history a new and more intimate meaning for us. It is bringing us into direct relation with public affairs, making them matter as formerly they didn't seem to matter. That idea of the bright little private life has to go by the board. I suppose it has, she said, meditatively, as though she had been thinking over some such question before. The private life, she said, has a way of coming aboard again. Her reflections travelled fast and broke out now far ahead of him. You have some sort of work cut out for you, she said abruptly. Yes, I have. I haven't, she said. So that I go about, she added, like someone who is looking for something. I'd like to know, if it's not jabbing too searching a question at you, what you have found. Sir Richmond considered. Incidentally, he smiled, I want to get a lasso over the neck of the very forcible and barbaric person, your father. I am doing my best to help lay the foundation of a scientific world control of fuel production and distribution. We have a fuel commission in London with rather wide powers of inquiry into the whole world problem of fuel. We shall come out to Washington presently with proposals. Miss Grammont surveyed the landscape. I suppose, she said, poor father is rather like an unbroken mule in business affairs. So many of our big businessmen in America are. He'll lash out at you. I don't mind if only he lashes out openly in the sight of all men. She considered and turned on Sir Richmond gravely. Tell me what you want him to do. You find him so many things for me that I seem to have been thinking about in a sort of almost invisible half-conscious way. I've been suspecting for a long time that civilization wasn't much good unless it got people like my father under some sort of control. But controlling father, as distinguished from managing him, she reviewed some private and amusing memories. He is a most intractable man. Section 3. They had got on to talk of her father and of the types of men who controlled international business. She had had plentiful opportunities for observation in their homes and her own. Gunter Lake, the big banker, she knew particularly well because it seemed she had been engaged or was engaged to marry him. All these people, she said, are pushing things about, affecting millions of lives, hurting and disordering hundreds of thousands of people. They don't seem to know what they are doing. They have no plans in particular, and you are getting something going that will be a plan and a direction and a conscience and a control for them. You will find my father extremely difficult, but some of our younger men would love it. And, she went on, there are American women who'd love it too. We're petted. We're kept out of things. We aren't placed, We don't get enough to do. We're spenders and wasters, not always from choice. While these fathers and brothers and husbands of ours play about with the fuel and the power of life and hope of the world as though it was a game of poker, with all the empty, unspeakable solemnity of the male, and treat us as though we ought to be satisfied if they bring home part of the winnings. That can't go on, she said. Her eyes went back to the long, low, undulating skyline of the downs. She spoke as though she took up the thread of some controversy that had played a large part in her life. That isn't going on, she said, with an effect of conclusive decision. Sir Richmond recalled that little speech now as he returned from Salisbury Station to the Old George after his farewell to Martineau. He recalled too the soft firmness of her profile and the delicate line of her lifted chin. He felt that this time, at any rate, he was not being deceived by the outward show of a charming human being. This young woman had real firmness of character to back up her free and independent judgments. He smiled at the idea of any facile passion in the composition of so pure and gallant a personality. Martineau was very fine-minded in many respects, but he was an old maid, and like all old maids, he saw man and woman in every encounter. But passion was a thing men and women fell back upon when they had nothing else in common. When they thought in the pleasantest harmony and every remark seemed to weave a fresh thread of common interest, then it wasn't so necessary. It might happen, but it wasn't so necessary. If it did, it would be a secondary thing to companionship. That's what she was, a companion. But a very lovely and wonderful companion, the companion one would not relinquish until the very last moment one could keep with her. Her views about America and about her own place in the world seemed equally fresh and original to Sir Richmond. I realize I've got to be a responsible American citizen, she had said. That didn't mean that she attached very much importance to her recently acquired vote. She evidently classified voters into the irresponsible who just had votes and the responsible who also had a considerable amount of property as well. She had no illusions about the power of the former class. It didn't exist. They were steered to their decisions by people employed, directed or stimulated by father and his friends and associates, the owners of America, the real responsible citizens. Or they fell prey to the merely adventurous leading of revolutionaries. But anyhow, they were steered. She herself, it was clear, was bound to become a very responsible citizen indeed. She would some day, she laughed, be swimming in oil and such like property. Her interest in Sir Richmond's schemes for a scientific world management of fuel was therefore, she realized, a very direct one. But it was remarkable to find a young woman seeing it like that. Father, it seemed, varied very much in his attitude towards her. He despised and distrusted women generally, and it was evident he made it quite clear to her how grave an error it was on her part to persist in being a daughter and not a son. At moments it seemed to Sir Richmond that she was disposed to agree with her father upon that. When Mr. Grammont's sense of her regrettable femininity was uppermost, then he gave his intelligence chiefly to schemes for tying her up against the machinations of adventurers by means of trustees, partners, lawyers, advisers, agreements, and such like complications, or for acquiring a workable son by marriage. To this last idea, it would seem the importance in her life of the rather heavily named Gunter Lake was to be ascribed. But another mood of the old man's was distrust of anything that could not be spoken of as his own flesh and blood, and then he would direct his attention to a kind of masculinization of his daughter and to the schemes for giving her the completest control of all he had to leave her, provided she never married nor fell under masculine sway. He would reflect as he hesitated over the practicability of his life's ideal. There was Hetty Green. This latter idea had reft her suddenly at the age of 17 from the educational care of an English gentlewoman, warranted to fit her for marriage with any prince in Europe, and thrust her for the mornings and a moiety of the afternoons for the better part of a year after a swift but competent training into a shirt waist and office downtown. She had been entrusted at first to a harvester concern independent of Mr. Grammont, because he feared his own people wouldn't train her hard. She had worked for ordinary wages and ordinary hours, and at the end of the day, she mentioned casually a large automobile with 2 men servants and a trustworthy secretary used to pick her out from the torrent of undistinguished workers that poured out of the synoptical building. This masculinization idea had also sent her on a commission of inquiry into Mexico. There apparently she had really done responsible work. But upon the question of labor, Mr. Grammont was fierce, even for an American businessman, and one night at a dinner party he discovered his daughter displaying what he considered an improper familiarity with socialist ideas. This had produced a violent revulsion towards the Purdah system and the idea of a matrimonial alliance with Gunter Lake. Gunter Lake, Sir Richmond gathered, wasn't half a bad fellow. Generally, it would seem Miss Grammont liked him, and she had a way of speaking about him that suggested that in some way Mr. Lake had been rather hardly used and had acquired merit by his behaviour under bad treatment. There was some story, however, connected with her war services in Europe, upon which Miss Grammont was evidently indisposed to dwell. About that story Sir Richmond was left at the end of his Avebury day, and after his last talk with Dr. Martineau, still quite vaguely guessing. So much fact about Miss Grammont as we have given had floated up in fragments and pieced itself together in Sir Richmond's mind in the course of a day and a half. The fragments came up as allusions or by way of illustration. The sustaining topic was this new age Sir Richmond foreshadowed. This world under scientific control, the utopia of fully developed people fully developing the resources of the earth. For a number of trivial reasons, Sir Richmond found himself ascribing the project of this new age almost wholly to Dr. Martineau and presenting it as a much completer scheme than he was justified in doing. It was true that Dr. Martineau had not said many of the things Sir Richmond ascribed to him, but also it was true that they had not crystallized out in Sir Richmond's mind before his talks with Dr. Martineau. The idea of a new age necessarily carries with it the idea of fresh rules of conduct and of different relationships between human beings, and it throws those who talk about it into the companionship of a common enterprise. Tomorrow the new age will be here, no doubt, but today it is the hope and adventure of only a few human beings. So that it was natural for Miss Grammont and Sir Richmond to ask, "What are we to do with such types as father?" and to fall into an idiom that assumed